Biden's at it again, but this time he's coming on stronger. Recently, the Biden administration revealed the most stringent car emission standards ever. Its goal is to push car makers and consumers alike to transition even faster into the EV era. Today, we're going to look at proposed standards and how they compare with current standards, the car industry's reaction, and how it'll impact you the next time you shop for a car. We'll also talk about the real reason why the White House is ambitiously trying to recreate the car industry. The latest proposed regulations were announced several weeks ago back in March by the Environmental Protection Agency. The proposed automobile pollution limits will require as much as 2/3 of all new vehicles sold here in the States to be electric by 2032. So the car industry has a lot cut out for them to electrify their lineup and or develop more EVs. And they only have 9 years left to do it. If you're thinking 9 years is a long time, well, to put that in perspective, that's almost a 10-fold increase compared to current EV sales. The proposed tailpipe emission limits for 2027 through 2032 model years is the strictest regulations the EPA has ever imposed by a long shot. It's a lot higher of an EV sales target than the auto industry originally agreed to 2 years ago. The proposal is expected to be finalized next year. According to EPA Administrator Michael Regan, the latest proposal contains the most ambitious pollution standards ever for cars and trucks. In fact, it's so strict that it's pushing car makers and consumers to an almost unthinkable shift from gasoline-powered cars and trucks to battery-powered vehicles. Before the EPA emissions regulations get finalized, the proposed standards, along with several alternative options, will be open for public comment. That makes it open for revisions before anything comes to effect. It all depends on how the public and the industry react. Now let's be clear. These proposed tailpipe emissions don't require a specific number of EVs to be sold each year. What it would mandate is limits on greenhouse gas emissions. EPA wants and expects almost 60% of new passenger vehicles sold here in the U.S. to be electric by 2030. And that production bumps up to as much as 67% by 2032. For medium-duty trucks, the EPA expects 46% of new sales to be electric in 2032. The EPA also predicts that 50% of buses and 25% of long-haul tractor trailers to be electric by 2032. Of course, this all depends on how car makers respond to comply with the regulations once they're set in stone. Regardless of industry reaction, the EPA believes these regulations will reduce dangerous air and climate pollution overall and lower fuel and maintenance costs for consumers. Here's the thing. Major car makers have been trying to electrify in recent years. They hear the death knell for combustion engine cars loud and clear. Last year, Ford sold 61,575 EVs in the U.S. alone. By the end of the year, Ford aims to sell 600,000 EVs globally per year. GM sold 39,096 EVs last year, and is planning to build 1 million EVs per year by 2025. But here's the thing. With this new proposal, the EPA just doesn't want to be cleaner and greener cars. It wants to completely transform the auto industry as we know it. Yes, car makers are already on the march. But now, the proposed regulation will only accelerate the process. The reality is that different car makers have different timelines for electrifying. And many cars have publicly specified plans that are anywhere close to 60% EV goal by 2032. As it is, many car makers think that President Biden's previously announced target is hard to reach as it is. That target is for 50% of new cars sold by 2030 to be electric. That's not a low-hanging fruit that's easy to grab. Now just consider what the new proposal pushing for 60%. By EPA calculations, the net benefits to the U.S. will be between $850 billion and $1.6 trillion. And also, according to the EPA's estimates, complying with these proposed rules would increase per-vehicle production costs by $633 in 2027 to about $1,200 in 2032. Advocates aren't alarmed by the cost increase because they say in the long run it will save consumers an average of $9,000 on fuel, maintenance, and repair costs. All this is to say that the Biden administration and the EPA are happy and hopeful about the new proposed rules. But that happiness isn't trickling down to the car industry. So there's a trade group representing Ford, GM, and other car makers. It's called the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Well, the group's CEO, John Bozzella, says the new EPA proposal is aggressive by any and every measure. In a statement, he wrote that the proposal exceeds the Biden administration's 50% EV sales target for 2030 that was announced less than 2 years ago. And he wasn't happy about it. Reaching that 50% target is already a stretch goal that depends on manufacturing incentives and tax credits to make EVs more affordable. He says the question right now isn't whether the new EPA proposal is achievable or not. Instead, the question is, how fast can it be done? And that ultimately, the answer to that question will exclusively depend on having the right policies and market conditions in place. Anyway, GM said it's reviewing the EPA proposal. The car maker is also calling for other policies to be implemented that can help speed up investment and adoption of EV cars. For example, policies that permit reform and support for domestic investments in manufacturing, supply chain, and charging infrastructure. European car maker Stellantis also expressed its distaste for the new proposal. It's surprised that none of the alternatives that were proposed by the EPA aligned with Biden's previously announced target of 50% EVs by 2030. Now, it's not just car makers who aren't happy with these new regulations. So are some U.S. states. I'm particularly talking about Republican states. Republican states, led by Texas, have already sued the EPA over the current version of vehicle standards. These states argue that the EPA overstepped its authority when creating those EV rules. That was when the regulations were less strict. Now that the EPA is proposing even stricter rules, we can expect these same states, plus a few others, to be even more vocal. Regardless of whether or not you like the latest proposal, the question really should be, is it realistic? Because if it's not realistic, it's not going to happen. Well, if you ask me, we have to look at the facts right now as we know them. During the first quarter of this year, EV sales made up only 7.2% of U.S. vehicle sales. That's not even 10%. Obviously, that number pales in comparison to the 60% EPA target that could be set for 2032 if the proposal gets approved. Now that's all said, it doesn't necessarily mean there's no hope. Yeah, 7.2% is a low percentage, but it's higher than the year before. Last year, EVs made up 5.8% of new vehicle sales. So the percentage is growing, but just slowly. At this rate, many industry analysts don't believe that EV sales will grow fast enough to reach the 60% target by 2032. One consulting firm called LMC Automotive, for example, estimates new EV sales could reach 49%, but probably won't exceed it by 2032. Basically, a large part of it really boils down to EVs compared to gas-powered cars. Or consider what former GM executive Larry Burns says. He says the car industry isn't ready for these new regulations at all. As it stands, the industry still needs one more learning cycle with consumers, infrastructure, technology, and supply base. And he believes that the industry needs to go a little slower if it wants to go faster later with better technology. And it's not just analysts who are skeptical. So are many American consumers. Several weeks ago, there was a poll. The data showed that many Americans still aren't fully sold on the idea of going electric for the next car. For most Americans, the reason comes down to high EV prices and not enough charging stations. And get this, in the poll, only 19% of U.S. adults said it's very or extremely likely they'll purchase an EV the next time they buy a car. Another 22% said that EV purchase may be somewhat likely, whereas 47%, so almost half, said it's unlikely they'll go electric for their next car purchase. Now, I don't know if the EPA is looking at polls like that, but regardless, it doesn't sound too reassuring. When you compare data like that to the EPA proposal, well, you can see why many are saying the proposal is too aggressive. But here's yet another question. Can the world even mine enough minerals or build batteries quickly enough to reach car makers' existing production plants as it is? That's not even considering the stricter proposed targets. Aside from that, even if we could mine enough minerals and build batteries fast enough, we can't forget about the need for charging infrastructure. If the EPA expects the proposed targets to be met, the reality is that charging infrastructure needs to be built out. We'll also need to increase power generation. By the way, did you know that since Biden took office, the number of available EV models has doubled, and EV sales have tripled? Since Biden took office, the industry has announced over $100 billion in EV investment. In fact, it's because of this, the White House climate advisor, Ali Zaidi, believes that car makers do have the technology infrastructure and supply chain to achieve the latest proposal's targets with the lead time that they've got. On the bright side, the EPA expects the new proposal to have some major positive impacts on the environment. For example, the proposed standards for light-duty cars and trucks could result in a 56% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to existing standards for the 2026 model year. On top of that, the new emission standards could improve air quality across the country so much it could help us to avoid almost 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions by 2055. That's more than twice the total CO2 emissions we saw last year in the United States. The EPA also expects the new standards to reduce our reliance on some 20 billion barrels of oil imports into the States. You might not be too surprised to hear that transportation is actually the largest source of carbon emissions in the country. Some 27% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. in 2020 could be traced back to transportation. After that, electric power takes a second spot. It's responsible for about 25% of our greenhouse gas emissions. Needless to say, environmental groups are all for stricter tailpipe pollution standards. The reality is that if greenhouse gas emissions keep getting worse, so will our air quality and severe weather effects like wildfires, hurricanes, and tornadoes. There's a nonprofit environmental advocacy group called the Natural Resources Defense Council. Its president and CEO, Manish Bapna, says the new rules will put the U.S. on the path to end pollution from vehicle tailpipes while also slashing our dependence on oil. It will also create good domestic jobs and save consumers money on fuel. But here's a caveat. If only the new rules are done right, of course. Of course, the latest EPA proposal isn't the only thing the Biden administration is doing to accelerate EV adoption. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year is also a key player in helping the industry to reach these new, tougher targets. Right now, many North American manufactured EVs are eligible for a $7,500 tax credit. Other EVs can get up to a $4,000 tax credit. But some EVs are ineligible because of the high price or consumers' income doesn't meet the eligibility requirements. On top of that, several weeks ago, on April 18th, the Treasury Department set new requirements, and now less new EVs will qualify for the full $7,500 federal tax credit. Right now, the average EV costs about $58,600. If less people are eligible for the full $7,500 credit, and more are just getting a partial $4,000, industry analysts are skeptical whether it'll be enough to convert new buyers to the EV market. But now you tell me, are you likely to buy an EV the next time you need a car? And do you think the new proposal is realistic or too aggressive? Please share by commenting below. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for your support.